Fancy $5? The latest from podnews.net with Supporting Cast, your one-stop shop for selling subscriptions. In the latest in the fight for podcast listening apps, Amazon Music is paying some Australian listeners $5 in vouchers just for listening to a podcast on the platform. The offer's targeted and we're not eligible, but if you are, a reminder that Pod News Daily is just 5 minutes long. NewsGuard, a news reliability data service, has announced its entry into podcasting today. The company says it's the world's first journalist-vetted podcast credibility rating service. Its release includes example ratings for 5 podcasts. The finishing touches are being put on the New Zealand Podcast Summit this Saturday in Auckland. I'm the final keynote speaker. Also speaking, Jane Yee from The Spin-Off, Tim Watkin from RNZ, and Richard Palmer from Omni Studio. Tickets are still available, and we can exclusively reveal that there's a Pod News podcoaster in the goodie bag as well. Bumper has looked at ways to look at listen time as a method to measure your audience's engagement with your podcast. The company responds to concerns from us that a listen time metric penalises short shows like this one. PodcastClosing.com, a UK-based podcast sales consultancy, has acquired the Facebook group Need a Guest and the Podcast Network. Meanwhile, Amazon quietly acquired Snackable, an AI platform, late last year. Tech from that will appear in the Amazon Music app. And Matthew Passy has sold the podcast consultant to new owners. Passy's to leave the company after a handover period. He cites burnout and a wish to spend more time with the family. Thorn has joined the Spotify Safety Advisory Council. The company detects, identifies and reports child sexual abuse material. The DuPont Columbia Awards are open for submissions, setting the standard for audio and video reporting in broadcast, documentary and online. We'll link to more details on how to enter in our show notes and our newsletter at podnews.net. Following our reporting of Ashley Carman's story about dismal YouTube numbers on Friday, Folding Pocket contacted us with details of Up Front with Simon Jordan, a new podcast which was launched last week. That podcast is #1 sports podcast on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts, but also has more than 500,000 views on YouTube in less than a week. Pretty impressive, given that there are no podcasts on YouTube Music in the UK either. And Snipped has added Android Auto support for drivers to save podcast highlights while on the road. In People News, Megan Wastell has left Global, where she was Director of Podcasts and Strategy for Global Player. She's to be Global Creative Director for Merlin Entertainments, an operator of visitor attractions. It's time for some tech stuff, and dynamically changing value splits were demonstrated last week in the Podcasting 2.0 podcast. As a song was played, the value splits automatically changed in supporting apps to include the musician Joe Martin. The privacy-friendly Android podcast app AntennaPod version 3.0.2 is available now on Google Play and has a brand new home screen. And Amazon's CloudFront is on a 12-month high as a content delivery network, with 51% of new episodes in April hosted on the platform. And in podcast news, The Psychology of Your 20s has joined iHeart Podcasts. The show explains how everything is psychology, even in our 20s. The show was hosted on Spotify for podcasters. Podcasting 2.0 this week features Sam Sethi, who's co-host of the Pod News Weekly Review and CEO of Podfans. And Believe in Magic is a brand new podcast from the BBC with Jamie Bartlett, who previously hosted The Missing Crypto Queen. It's the story of a 16-year-old who set up a charity called Believe in Magic, which gained the backing of global celebrities One Direction. The charity granted wishes to seriously ill children, except Meghan, who set it up, then said she had a brain tumour and needed money for herself. And all is not quite what it seems. This podcast is sponsored by Supporting Cast. Supporting Cast is a one-stop shop for selling subscriptions through every major podcast app, including Spotify and Apple, without giving up 30% of your subscription revenue. You can learn more at supportingcast.fm. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.